Book 2, Part 7. I heard Jonathan talking in the hallway and quickly wiped my cheeks on my tattered little friend. When the door opened, I turned and smiled at him. He was wearing dark blue cotton pajama pants and a white t-shirt. The light clicked off and I felt the butterflies explode as he moved towards me. Suddenly, I was extremely nervous. He crawled onto the bed, staying on top of the covers. My heart raced and I stiffened. "Would you rather I sleep in my own room?" he whispered, and I bit my lip. How quickly I'd forgotten that he could hear my heartbeat. "No," I was able to reply. He chuckled and laid his head on the pillow. "As slow as you need, remember?" I nodded, still looking at him. We were laying on our sides, facing each other. This was so very different from sleeping with Track in so many ways. His gray eyes scanned mine, then he rolled onto his back. "I'm not sorry you're here, Reina, but I am sorry for the reason," he finally whispered. "Me too," was all I could think to say. Here we were, in the same bed, in his apartment, alone. My mind was racing as fast as my heart now. Maybe I was in way over my head. Even with him on top of the covers, my heart was racing. He rolled onto his back. The minutes ticked by slowly. Suddenly, I realized he was waiting for me to react. I lifted up a little and moved closer, then carefully laid my head on his shoulder. His arm wrapped around me and I smiled. This did feel good. Then I grunted and reached down, pulling Wolfie out from between us. Jonathan chuckled, took my little stuffed friend and held him in front of him. "Sorry, this spot is now taken." He went to throw him over to the chair, then stopped when I caught my breath. Instead, he reached over me and laid him on the nightstand. When he laid back down, we were face to face again. He took his other hand and stroked my cheek. "I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about this tomorrow," he whispered, and I lifted my head, my brows knitted. He chuckled and moved my hair out of my face. "After holding you all night, I may have to talk to your father to see just how firm he is on that 6-month rule." I smiled then and laid my head back on his arm, pulling my arms up and snuggling against his chest. Yeah, this was nothing like sleeping with Track. I smiled again and closed my eyes, drifting quickly. Chapter 7. I wish I could say I slept peacefully in his arms, but I didn't. The dreams crept in and tormented me. In the first one, I was standing on the manor grounds. My dad, Jonathan, and all the vampires were on the manor side. My pack was on the other. I was shouting at each side in turn, trying to get them to understand that this was all a mistake. They never talked. They never moved. They just stood there, glaring past me at the other side. I screamed until my throat hurt, running up to them and pleading with them. They didn't look at me, and they didn't move. Even Track was like a marble statue when I flung my arms around his neck and cried hard. His eyes were tight with anger and fixed on those across the lawn. "Please, please listen to me," I whispered up into his unmoving face. "I want things back the way they were. I'm so sorry." A soft wind tossed his hair around his hard face, but he didn't even blink. So much anger in those eyes. Then the scene swirled around me, like someone wiping their hands through wet paint. I was in the forest now, in vampire form. The night air was cold, and I wrapped my arms around me, listening to the sounds that came from this place when no one else was there. Something moved in the darkness, and I turned, my eyes wide with fear. "Hello?" I called out. "You should not be here," a low voice replied. I shivered then. The words dripped with hate. "I just want to talk," I tried. Another rustling sound from my other side, and I turned quickly. This time a wolf stepped out. His golden coat seemed odd in the eerie forest. "Phil?" I whispered, and he took a step towards me. My heart raced, but not with fear. Suddenly another wolf leapt out and lunged. Phil jumped into the air, and they collided and came down fighting. "You need to leave," another voice stated, and I turned to look over my shoulder. The air turned bitter cold, and I began to shiver. "I just want to make things better," I stuttered through chattering teeth. "Reina." I turned back to the fight. This time only the second wolf stood there. I looked around for Phil, my heart aching. I shivered harder, and the large wolf shook his head. "Reina," came the voice again, and I turned in circles. "Phil?" I called out, a panic creeping through me. I took a few steps in one direction, and the large wolf trotted over to block my path. "Phil!" I yelled over its massive form. "Where are you?" Then I felt myself start to shake harder. "Reina!" a voice called out to me, and suddenly my eyes shot open. Jonathan was sitting over me, his hands on my shoulders. "Reina, wake up!" I blinked again and then looked around. "It was just a dream," he stated, though I saw the worry in his eyes. I swallowed hard and nodded, then shivered. He laid down and pulled me into his arms, bringing the covers up under my chin. "It was just a dream," he cooed, kissing the top of my head. When I didn't reply, he nuzzled against me. "Do you want to talk about it?" As he continued to rub his face against my head, I told him all I could remember about both dreams. He listened quietly and then lifted my chin. "Both dreams make complete sense given all that's happened." "How so?" I whispered. "I mean, I can understand the first one, but what about in the woods?" "You ran off into the woods in real life to find Phil so you can apologize," he stated, now stroking my hair. "You didn't get to do that." "Oh," I whispered, moving so my head was under his chin. That did make sense. He started talking then, softly rubbing my head and hair. He talked about little things that had nothing to do with much of anything. I relaxed, and before I knew it, I was asleep again. This time, no dreams haunted me. When I opened my eyes again, I yawned and then smiled as Jonathan's arms hugged me softly. I was still laying on his shoulder, and I snuggled up and ran my hand slowly over his chest. "I like waking up like this," he whispered. "So do I smiled. "I am definitely going to have to talk to our dads about the whole 6-month thing." I chuckled. "So what, you want to wait longer now?" I teased. He flipped me on my back and leaned over me. His hair was tossed, and I swear he looked hotter than normal. I blinked innocently, and he laughed. "I can't wait 6 months," he finally said, and my eyes grew wide. "After tonight, I'm not sure I could wait 6 days." Okay, I didn't think it was possible, but my eyes grew even bigger. He leaned down and kissed my cheek. "My sweet Reina, so innocent, with no idea the power you have." "Power?" I whispered in a shaky voice. "Mm-hmm," he smiled. "The power you have over men." I rolled my eyes nervously, and he nodded. "You have bewitched me." I giggled. "So what will it be? Burn me at the stake or the chopping block?" He shook his head. "The Union altar, I think." The smile fell from my face. He chuckled. "Would you rather the stake?" When he moved off me, laying on his side now, I shrugged. "Well, no, I'm not that fond of fire, actually." Then I rolled on my side as well, tucking my hands under my cheek and looking at him. "Would you really dare the scorn of the entire vampire world for a witch?" I wiggled my brows, and he smiled. I would dare the scorn of the entire world for you." My smile softened and I looked up into his gray eyes. I felt my chest tighten as I looked from one of them to the other. "I want to stay right here," I finally whispered. "In bed?" he teased. I nodded. "In this bed, with you." "Done!" he proclaimed and reached over and pulled me into his arms. To hell with the rest of the world, vampires or otherwise. My witch gets whatever she wants. I giggled again and lifted my head, kissing his jaw. "Aren't you afraid of being bewitched?" "Not even a little bit," he snickered back. I wrapped my arm around his chest and squeezed him softly, sighing happily. Yes, I could lay here forever. Then, of course, there was a soft knock on the door. This time, Jonathan actually growled, and I looked up at him. He shrugged, grinning now. "Not bad," I winked, and he smiled. When he moved to get up, I moaned. "I'm just going to inform them that we are not to be disturbed," he explained as he stood. I gave him a playful frown and reached for Wolfie. He snatched him first. "I will not be replaced so quickly," he whispered in a theatrical tone, his eyes sparkling. I giggled again and tried to snatch my stuffed animal from him. He jumped back quickly. "This little rival has come between us once too many times. I see how you look at him. I know that you want him." Then he moved towards me quickly, and I gasped and sat up, leaning back. He put his hands on the bed, ignoring the knock that was a little louder this time. He frowned. "Tell me now that he is who you want." He lifted one hand, my little friend in his grip. My hands moved to my chest and I blinked fast. I let my eyes move to Wolfie and then to him. He shook his head, then looked at Wolfie. "I challenge you to a duel. To the death," he hissed at the black beaded eyes. I giggled and he stood. "The lady's honor requires as much, and her heart is mine, I tell you." The knocking got louder then. He frowned and sat Wolfie on the chair by the door, then shook his finger at him. "Sit tight. I will slay you shortly." Then he smiled over his shoulder at me and opened the door. Michaud was standing there, with a frown on his face. I shrunk back in the bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. "Mr. Blvd is on the phone," he stated in a hard voice. Jonathan nodded and looked back at me. "I will return shortly, my lady." Then he winked and stepped out into the hallway. I laughed and pulled the covers up over my head. After several minutes I peeked out and looked around the room. I smiled over at the chair. It was now empty. I glanced around the room and then sat up. "Where did he put you?" I whispered, and moved to the edge of the bed. I reached up and scratched the bandage around my neck. Itching was a good sign. It meant it was healing. I stood and stretched, never realizing it could feel good in this form too. It wasn't nearly as satisfying, but I smiled and stepped towards the door. It was partially open, and I heard voices in the other room. Not wanting to be snapped back to reality just yet, I went into the bathroom and ran a brush through my hair. I eyed the gauze and then moved my hair off my shoulder. I turned down an edge of it and twisted to see the damage in the mirror. I flinched. It still wasn't pretty, but they were right. It would heal in a few days. When I walked back into the room, I frowned. How long was this going to take? I wanted to crawl back into bed with him and laugh and giggle. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. It was only 3 p.m. "I've got to get back on a schedule," I said to myself, and then looked around the room. I finally sighed and walked out into the hallway, following the voices to the living room. As I stepped out, Michael looked over and Jonathan turned, the phone to his ear. He raised his brow at me playfully, and I shrugged. "Yes, Mr. Blvd, I understand," he stated, and walked up to me smiling. I looked around the room. Michael and Martin were standing near their little makeshift security desk. The wolves were nowhere to be seen, although I knew they couldn't be asleep at this hour. Jonathan wrapped one arm around my waist, and I leaned towards the phone. "Hello, Daddy," I smiled. "Reina?" Jonathan handed me the phone and moved behind me, wrapping both arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. I smiled. "Who else calls you Daddy?" I teased into the phone. There was a soft chuckle. "I see you're in a good mood today." I nodded. "Yes, I am. How are you?" Then I mentally kicked myself. How are things going? Have you talked to Ryan?" I asked, the smile melting away. Jonathan gave me a supportive hug, and I leaned back against him. "He's coming to the manor in about an hour." My dad's voice was tinted with his anger. "We will work this out, sweetheart." "I wish I could be there for the talk." I added for Jonathan's sake, "This was all just a huge misunderstanding, Dad, and it's 100% my fault. Please," I lowered my voice, "I just want things back the way they were." "I know you do, sweetheart," my dad stated, and I heard the battle in his voice. Was he only doing this for me? Didn't he want things back too? "I will call you as soon as we're done talking," was all I got. "Please, Dad, this really is all my fault. I shouldn't have snuck out. I should have just kept asking to talk to Phil, or stopped asking and waited until they said it was okay." "We still need to find out why they were keeping you out of Polson." "Ryan hasn't told you yet?" That surprised me. It was one thing to keep it from me. They all did that. But not to tell my dad? "No, he hasn't." "What can be going on over there?" I whispered, more to myself. "That's what I intend to find out." Then he changed his tone. "I do hope Jonathan is being a gentleman," he stated, his words light but dipped in a threat. Jonathan stiffened behind me, and I laughed. "He is, for the most part." "The most part?" My dad's voice tightened again. "Well, he did challenge Wolfie to a duel over me. I'm a little worried, Dad. Wolfie isn't very good at dueling." He laughed then, and Jonathan kissed the back of my head. "Well, you two kids have a good, safe, honorable time." I rolled my eyes. "Dad, really, you have Michael and 3 other guards here. Just what do you think—" "Never mind." I chuckled. "Just promise me you will hear Ryan out and try to make peace." "I promise to listen if he is willing to talk," came that voice that said he wasn't going to be cordial. I sighed. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart, and the manor is a shell without you here." I heard the sadness in his voice then, and my eyes watered a little bit. I so wanted to be home, but I also wanted what I was having with Jonathan. Suddenly, a thought hit me, and I smiled. "I love you, Daddy," I stated, then handed the phone back to Jonathan as my dad's reply trailed off. Jonathan took the phone and eyed me suspiciously. I grinned. That was it. The perfect solution. Jonathan and I didn't have to find our own place. We could live at the manor. There was plenty of room. I glanced around, nodding to myself. I'm sure my dad would even create a wing of rooms just for us, so we could have our privacy too. I bounced and felt his stare. When I turned, he shrugged, grinning, his eyes asking me what had me so excited. "I'll tell you when you're done," I whispered. He nodded and turned back to his conversation, stealing grins over at me as I tried to sit still on the couch waiting. When he finally hung up, I jumped up and told him my brilliant plan. He nodded, but only looked over to where Michael and Martin were pretending they couldn't hear us. What's wrong? I asked, totally confused by his lack of enthusiasm. He took my hand and lifted it to his lips, kissing the back of it softly. I waited, my excitement ebbing slowly. Reina, He looked up at me and I shrugged. Wouldn't you rather have a place to ourselves? He finally asked. I blinked hard. Well, yes, but I'm sure my dad would redo my wing and change it into our wing. We would have plenty of privacy then. He stood quietly and I racked my brain to find fault in my plan. It seemed flawless. I understood that we would need our own place. I wasn't that naive. But it was possible, very possible. I don't understand, I finally whispered. Jonathan looked back over his shoulder, then took my hand and walked me down the hallway. This time, he took me to his bedroom. I stood and waited, still completely puzzled, as he shut the doors. When he turned to me, his eyes were careful. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without it coming out wrong, he finally explained. He stepped up to me and gave me a soft smile. Reina, I love you. I went to open my mouth and he shook his head. I mean, I completely, utterly, and totally love you. I'm also in love with you. When he paused, I nodded. Yes, I know the difference. Sheesh. With all of that said, I'm still a man, Reina. I balked. What in the world did that mean? He looked around the room. It's hard to explain. I pulled my hand away from him and he shook his head. Please, just hear me out. I huffed and he looked at me hard. Are you really going to condemn me on that? Okay, he had a point. I just don't understand what you're trying to say. Probably because I can't figure out how to say it, he chuckled. I wasn't worried he had changed his mind. I had gotten over that insecurity, for the most part, but I was still at a complete loss. He took another step towards me, and I didn't back away. Whatever it was, he was trying, and I had to be supportive and listen. A man, he chuckled. Most men, well, me, like to stand on our own 2 feet. He looked at me and I chewed my lip, trying to register the information. If we moved into the manor, he stated, and then my eyes opened. The dots connected. You would feel like you were living off of my dad, I offered, and he nodded, looking relieved. Wow, I actually understood, and it even made sense. I smiled at him, and this time I reached for his hand. He wanted to be the one to support us. It meant a lot to him. It may be his pride, but it was also his honor and value system, and I couldn't ask him to let go of all of that because I didn't like sleeping in a strange place. Okay then, I smiled, and his eyes widened a little. Hey, as understanding and patient as he had been with me, it was the least I could do. I nodded, and he pulled me into his arms. How did I get this lucky, he whispered, and then leaned down and kissed me. We ended up laying on his bed, both on top of the covers, and we talked for over an hour. I teased him at one point, saying that he brought me here just to get me away from Wolfie. He laughed. I didn't think you'd notice that part of my evil plan. I heard Michael talking to someone down the hall, and reality hit me. As wonderful as this was, and it was wonderful, there were some very serious things going on, and I couldn't forget about them. Jonathan sat up too, his smile slipping as he saw the look on my face. I shrugged. I'm sorry. If we were here without... I looked at the door and he nodded. I should feel guilty for this, he stated, and when I looked at him he gave me a small smile. I'm so glad to have you here. I wrinkled my nose at him playfully, leaned over and gave him a soft kiss, then moved to the side of the bed. Do you think they're still talking? I asked, looking down at the thick rug. Your dad and Ryan? When I nodded, he moved up next to me. Knowing those two, I'm sure they are. He gave a soft chuckle, and I did too. When I reached up and scratched at the back of my neck, he moved my hair and peeked under the bandage. It's healing nicely. I nodded and sighed. Should I call? If you want to, then you should. He reached over and picked up his cell phone, holding it out to me. I took it and sat staring at it. What if things weren't going so well? Part of me was afraid to call and hear that things were not only not better, but maybe worse. Jonathan was sitting next to me now, and I gave him a weak smile. Maybe I'll wait a little longer. My dad would have called if they were done. I added the last part as an excuse. He nodded, and I set the phone back on his nightstand. The room went quiet, and I looked up at the curtains, not really seeing them. I felt his hand on mine and blinked, glancing down at it. Would anything ever be the same? We both looked over at his nightstand as the phone rang. It was the landline this time. Jonathan stood and picked it up. I held my breath. Hello? Then he smiled. Hello, Aunt Mary. I relaxed and flopped backwards onto the bed, looking up at him. Yes, she is actually. How did you... He chuckled and winked at me, and I rolled my eyes. Leave it to Aunt Mary to find out I was hiding out at Jonathan's. No, it's just for a few days. Yes, Aunt Mary, we are. Yes, her guards are... I giggled, as he was barely able to get a few words in, and I imagined the onslaught that was happening on the other end. Jonathan walked over and sat down next to me, then laid on his back as well. I could hear her voice now, and she was going on about protocol and how important it was that he not damage my reputation. I covered my mouth to silence my laugh, and he winked at me. Yes, Aunt Mary, I do love her, very much. I would never... He sighed as she interrupted again. He was quiet through the rest of her tirade, though he rolled over on his side and smiled down at me. I turned into him and nuzzled up under his chin, draping one arm over his side. He was propped up on one elbow now, the phone in that hand. He took his other hand and ran it down my arm. I sighed softly. Jonathan, are you listening to me? Yes, Aunt Mary. I giggled into his chest. Is that Reina? Yes, Aunt Mary. Oh, that poor dear. I can't imagine what she must be going through. I'm taking good care of her. Jonathan Hilver, you hear me now. If you... He sat up quickly and then stood up. I rolled onto my back, frowning up at him. What was that for? He turned away from me, lowering his voice. Aunt Mary, if you really think so little of me... Yes, I understand. His shoulders dropped, and I stood up and moved behind him. This time I wrapped my arms around his waist and hugged him softly. He needed my support now. I felt him straighten and his voice become stronger. Aunt Mary, I appreciate all that you're trying to do. Reina is very safe from all things. I have to go, but again, thank you for calling. He clicked the phone and I shook my head. He twisted around so he was facing me. Seems Aunt Mary has decided it is her personal responsibility to make sure your honor stays intact. I laughed and he shook his head. I'm definitely going to have to talk to our fathers. He kissed the top of my head, if for no other reason than to keep her from locking me away for the next 6 months. We both laughed then. Another phone rang and I moaned, but we both looked around to find the cause. His cell phone was sitting next to the landline, and I didn't have mine yet. It stopped quickly, and we both looked at the door, holding our breath. Well, at least I was. A moment later there was a knock, and even though I had expected it, I jumped a little. Jonathan walked to the door and opened it. Michael stood, taking up most of the doorway, his cell phone in his hand. He looked at me. "Your father is on his way here." "Here?" I yelped, and my bodyguard nodded slowly. I turned to Jonathan. "That can't be good. If everything was okay, he would just tell us to come back." I shook my head, looking around the room as my mind began to race. Jonathan reached over and took my hand. "We don't know that." "Yes, we do," I nearly snapped back. My stomach tightened and I put a free hand over it. He took that hand too and stood in front of me, smiling at me the way you do at a crazy person. "Reina, let's just wait until your father gets here and see what he has to say." "No!" I yelled, although I couldn't tell you why. What other choice did we really have? I yanked my hands away, rushed past Michael, and trotted down to my room. Once inside, I headed for the closet and began rummaging through my suitcases for clothes, tossing things on the floor as I did. I grabbed things without caring what they were and then rushed into the bathroom. I wasn't worried about getting dressed before he got here. It would take him an hour to do that. I just couldn't seem to slow down. The panic raced through me, and I was dressed in a flash. Then I stood in front of the large mirror, staring at my reflection. My dad was not coming here to tell us everything was fine now, and I could come home. My stomach churned and my eyes watered. All of this over my stupid attempt to get Phil to forgive me. I closed my eyes, not wanting to look at myself. I had been so stupid. But really, even if I had stopped and thought about what might happen if I got caught, this would have never entered my mind. I did want to know what my pack was hiding from me. That part hurt deeply. That always protected me, like my dad, from the more serious side of the world. But this, keeping me out of Poulsen, and especially keeping me from talking to my alpha, it made no sense. Anger seeped in and pushed some of the pain away. I looked back up into the mirror. Did it even have anything to do with the night I couldn't remember? I took a slow, deep breath and tried to remember that night. I put my hands on the counter, leaning forward, and tried to focus. I remembered the smells of the forest, some sounds. I remember feeling panicked, but that was all. I growled softly and tried to force the memories to come. Finally, I gave a soft sigh and stood, shaking myself a little. Someone knocked on the door and I yelped, stepping away from the sink. My hands were shaking now, and that strange pull was there again. I looked around the bathroom and suddenly felt trapped. "Reina?" came Jonathan's voice from the other side. "Can I come in?" My pulse slowed and the panic ebbed. I nodded, then gave a small yes. The door opened and Jonathan looked at me. His smile fell and he hurried over. I put one hand up and shook my head. "I'm okay," I whispered. He slowed but kept walking. I lowered my gaze, seeing his feet move closer. "Reina?" The anger and fear ignited again and my head shot up. "Jonathan, my dad's coming with bad news. Anything else he would have told us over the phone." He watched me, but I saw in his eyes that he knew it too. No one drives an hour just to tell you everything is back to being wonderful and you could come home. Plus, my dad didn't even call me or Jonathan. He called Michael and told him. I put a hand on my stomach. The nagging pull mixed with my fears made me a little queasy. "You need to sit down." I nodded. Jonathan took my hand and led me out to my room, through my room and into the living room. I gasped as we sat and then closed my eyes. "Not now. Not now," I hissed as the tingles started in my legs. I couldn't shift now, not with my dad on the way. I needed to be able to talk to him and not with Jonathan as my translator. I clenched my teeth and pushed the sensation away. It fought with me this time, and I shook a bit as I struggled with it. Finally, it was gone. I drew in a shaky breath and opened my eyes. Luckily, Jonathan was not staring at me. He had turned away and was saying something to Michael over the back of the couch. When he did look at me, I nodded, and he gave me a small smile. We heard his cell phone ringing, and he jumped up, since he had left it in his bedroom. He jogged off, and I turned and leaned against the arm of the couch, pulling my legs up and crossing them in front of me. I looked over at Michael, and he turned from his computer and gave me a supportive smile. I sighed, and his eyes softened. "I wish I knew what to say," he stated softly, and my eyes widened. I gave a small nod and turned away. Jonathan didn't come back for several minutes, and when he did, he didn't look happy at all. His jaw was tight and his body was tense when he sat down. "What's wrong?" When he didn't answer, I smiled. "It wasn't Aunt Martha Mary again, was it?" He chuckled and shook his head. "Thankfully, no." More silence, and finally I stood and started to pace. I walked by Michael's small security station, looking over his massive shoulders. He had 2 laptops set up. One had 4 images on it showing the elevator, the garage, and 2 more areas that were outside somewhere. He looked up at me and I smiled. "Is all of that really necessary?" "It gives me something to do," he chuckled, and I wrinkled my nose at him. Then he turned and we both watched the 2 werewolves walking past the camera outside. "Where's Martin?" I asked as they disappeared from view. "Down in the garage," he stated. "You guys really need a more fulfilling job," I teased. And he shook his head. "You keep things pretty interesting." I nudged his arm with mine, and he smiled. Just then, Martin walked up to the camera in the dimly lit garage, gave a thumbs up, and then walked off. The clock on the corner of the screen said it was 7 p.m. Again my stomach tightened, and that strange pull wiggled in. A wave of sadness washed over me, and I looked up, staring at nothing. I got the sense that I was losing something. My heart squeezed, and I felt my throat tighten. A wave of deep sadness mixed with panic, and I didn't realize I was crying until Jonathan turned me to him, and I felt the wetness on my cheeks. He wiped them and frowned. "We'll get through this, whatever it is." I nodded numbly and stood while he finished clearing away my tears. There were more that wanted to fall. The pain was intense, but I forced them back. I also didn't want to lose Jonathan. How much could one guy take? I looked up into his beautiful gray eyes and suddenly worried that all of this might be too much for him. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, and my brows rose. "No, I didn't hear you say it. Those dark brown eyes say a lot more than you think." He winked at me, and I nodded. I started to pace again and barely noticed Jonathan on the phone, telling the cleaning lady she wasn't needed today. The room was quiet, aside from Michael talking to one of the other guards on his phone. Jonathan finally sat on the couch and let me pace. I walked to my room at one point, changed my shirt, brushed my hair, then came back out. Michael and Jonathan noticed, but neither said a word. Finally, when I thought I would crawl out of my skin, Michael turned. "Mr. Blvd is here." Chapter 8. I nearly tripped as I ran over to him and looked down at the screens. I saw 2 SUVs pulling up, one all black, the other dark blue. They stopped and then moved forward slowly. Michael pointed to one of the 4 images on the screen. I watched as the cars came into view on that one. His phone rang, and I only half listened to him talk to Martin on it. The cars stopped, and then the doors opened. I ignored all the passengers except one. My dad stepped out, and I noticed the hard look on his face. He buttoned his suit jacket, and then they all stepped towards the elevator. I kept my eyes on my dad as they rode the elevators up. His face looked sad, but there was anger there as well. He was definitely not bringing good news. Michael stood, and I stepped over to the door with him, even though he pushed me a bit behind him out of habit. There was a soft ping, and the door slid open. My dad and 5 men stepped out. 5? Why would he bring so many? He saw me and smiled. I ran into his arms and hugged him hard. When he put his arms around me, I buckled, and the tears came again. I wanted him to tell me he had made it all better. He was my dad, and he said he would fix this. I heard the other men walk into the room, but I kept my eyes closed and my cheek pressed against his chest. Please make it all better, Daddy, I thought, as he stroked my hair and kissed the top of my head. When he cleared his throat, I opened my eyes, but stayed where I was. He chuckled then. I would like to think this is because you missed your dad so much. I had to smile then. He pulled me out and looked down at me, frowning when he saw my wet cheeks. He opened his mouth, but I shook my head. No, please. Unless you're going to tell me that everything is back to normal, I don't want to hear it. I sounded like a small child, but I didn't care. He wiped my face, the pain in his eyes taking my last hope away. This was not good. Jonathan walked up, and my dad turned me, reaching down and taking my hand. I frowned. Just how bad was this? We walked into the living room, the others gathering around Michael's little station. 2 nodded and stepped back to the elevator. I saw my dad give Jonathan a look, and I frowned. Then he turned to me. Sweetheart, I know you're not going to like this, but I need to talk with Jonathan. My eyes bulged, and I shot my boyfriend a hard look. He and I are going to take a drive. What? You're both leaving? I gasped. My dad smiled at me. It's guy talk, Reina, and there's no place in this apartment that's safe from your ears. I frowned. He meant that there weren't any walls that I couldn't hear through? Why can't I know what you have to say? I snapped. Now I was mad. Confused, but mad. When I pulled my hand out of my dad's, he shook his head. I will talk with you when we get back, but for now, I need to talk to Jonathan. Okay, this was going too far. I shook my head, and I think I even stomped my foot. No, whatever that you have to say, you will say with me here, or there, or wherever. Wow, I was no good at this being demanding thing. I squared my shoulders. I'm sick and tired of everyone keeping things from me. I'm not stupid. I have handled a lot lately, and I'm sure that what you say has to affect on me. So, it's my business too. I ended by slamming my arms across my chest. Yeah, I really wasn't any good at this. My dad's brows went up, and I instantly felt my resolve slip. How did he do that? His head tilted just slightly, and my stance weakened as well. I bit my lip and tried to get angry again, but either his look was too alpha for the wolf in me, or it was simply that dad thing. There was a third option that was worse than either of those, and was probably the most correct. I was a wimp. I did manage to avoid him when he went to reach for me. There was some small satisfaction in that. He shook his head at me, but I stayed where I was. I realized I wasn't going to win on this, but I would make it as hard on both of them as I could. This was so completely and utterly unfair. Reina, we will talk as soon as we get back, he tried, even giving me a smile. The nerve! Whatever, I hissed and turned, storming off towards the hidden hallway. A part of me panicked. I had never been so disrespectful to my dad, and I felt guilty for that. But I stormed down the hallway, into my room, and turned with the door in my hand. Part of me wanted to slam it, but that was just going too far. In fact, I left it open and walked over to plop on my bed. I waited for Jonathan to come in. I knew my dad wouldn't, but I was sure Jonathan would come back and calm me down. The minutes passed, and no one came. When I suddenly realized what must have happened, I jumped up and ran into the main room, not caring what I'd look like for doing it. Michael turned and then stood. My eyes quickly scanned the room. One of Dad's men stood from a chair, and I realized they were the only ones here. "They left?" I whispered to no one. Then the anger jumped. "They left!" I shouted. The other vampire took a step forward, but Michael shook his head, and they both stood quietly. I shook my own head and turned, looking around. "I can't believe they left," I growled, and then stomped towards the elevator. Dad's guard moved then and stood in front of it. I glared up at him. "And what exactly are you going to do?" I hissed. Never mind the fact that, with his size and power, he could probably do just about anything he wanted. But I was ticked. Michael stepped up. "Reina?" he said in a firm but soft voice. I turned on him, my eyes hard. "I want out of here, Michael. Now!" "You know I can't let you leave," he stated calmly, and that ticked me off even more. I looked around the room, then over his shoulder at the computers. Suddenly, I had an idea. I shrugged, turned, and headed down the hallway. This time, I went to Jonathan's room. I closed the door behind me and walked over to the phone. I snatched it triumphantly, and then pushed some numbers. When I put it to my ear, I felt rather proud of myself. If my dad wouldn't tell me what was going on, I would call Track. He'll tell me. I frowned when there was no ringing, and I looked at the display. It was blank. I huffed, thinking I must have pushed the wrong buttons, jabbed the end one hard. After a few seconds, I punched his number again, be more careful this time, then hit the talk button. Even before I put it to my ear, I could tell something was wrong. There was no ringing, no dial tone, no nothing. I growled at the phone and slammed it back into the cradle, then stormed back out into the living room. Michael was waiting. When I accused him of blocking the phone, he stood quietly, his arms folded in front of his massive form. That only made me angrier. "Why?" I finally asked. "Following orders," he stated, and I heard a small twinge of frustration in his voice. He wasn't happy about this either. I wanted to be mad at him, just to be mad at someone, but I couldn't. This wasn't his fault. Like he said, he was just following orders. So instead, I growled at my dad's guard, then spun around and marched back to my room. Yeah, very mature, I know. The room was small, and pacing over the limited area was very unfulfilling. I thought about what I was going to say to them when they got back. How dare they leave to talk about this and make me wait? This had to do with me more than any of them. It was one thing to keep all their business stuff away from me. I could care less about that. As I paced, I growled and told them both off, out loud. I confronted the chair and shook my finger at it as I told it how mean and selfish it was. The bed was accused of treating me like a mentally ill child that couldn't handle reality. I was telling the nightstand that I was old enough to handle this when I froze. My ears perked up, and I rushed out of the room as the elevator opened. Martin looked at me as he stepped off, but I ignored him, looking past him. I grumbled something under my breath when no one else was there and returned to my room, where I unleashed the rest of my wrath on the furniture. Finally, I flopped on the bed, looking up at the ceiling. The tears came again, and I rolled over and buried my face in my pillow. Some time later, there was a soft knock on the door. I froze, wondering if I had imagined it. When it came again, I slowly sat up, staring at it. Reina? I jumped off the bed and opened the door. My dad stood there, still not smiling. I lifted my chin a little and stepped out into the hallway. He started to walk to the other end, and I followed him, feeling my stomach tighten more. We ended up in Jonathan's study, and he stood from the couch when we walked in. I looked away from him, too hurt to do anything else. My dad closed the door and then motioned me to sit. "I'll stand," I growled, determined to make them suffer somehow. He nodded and faced me. As you know, the talk with the Poulsen Alpha did not go as well as I hoped. My heart nearly stopped. He didn't call him Ryan. He called him the Poulsen Alpha. This was bad. I closed my eyes, not wanting to hear what was going to come next. "I need you to stay here a little longer." "What?" I gasped, looking up at him. He nodded and gave me a soft smile. "I am working this out. Until then, I just want you here where you don't have to—" "Dad, I don't understand. Did you find out what they're trying to keep from me?" A look flashed over his face and was gone before I could figure it out. When he didn't answer, I shook my head. "No. I want to know what happened, and I want to go home now." I saw Jonathan move out of the corner of my eye, and I put one hand out. "No. No more babying, Reina," I hissed. "This has to do with me, and I want to know what it is." My dad stepped up and took my hand. I wanted to snatch it back, but I didn't. "I know this is hard for you to understand," he stated, and I huffed but kept quiet. I did talk with Ryan, and we didn't see eye to eye on some things. I noticed he was picking through his words very carefully now. "I know you want the details, but I have to ask that you just trust me right now." Why couldn't I be one of those people that could demand what she wanted and get it? Did I have no backbone at all? I was terrified to know what was behind all of this, and a small part of me was glad I wasn't going to find out. What kind of person did that make me? "Why won't you tell me?" I asked, though my anger had wilted. "I will tell you this," he stated, and I looked up at him. My stomach tightened as I watched him closely. He shook his head. His eyes were so sad when he looked at me. "Reina, that pack in Poulsen, they are not as wonderful as you thought." Suddenly, I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. What was going on over there? My pack was hiding something, and from my dad's reaction, it wasn't something they wanted others to know about either. I racked my brain trying to think what it could be, but came up empty. "They don't like the fact that you are dating a vampire," he finally added. I smiled then. "Dad, seriously?" My dad shook his head. "I mean, they really don't like it." I frowned, and he nodded. What did that mean? He walked me to the couch, and this time I sat down, still staring at him in disbelief. Jonathan had moved, but I barely noticed. My dad pulled a chair over and sat in front of me. He looked older somehow, worn, and it made me want to hug him. "I didn't realize how deeply they were against it," he stated in a quiet tone. "But after talking to the Alpha and hearing the stories he tried to spin—" He shook his head, and I noticed him clench and unclench his fist. "I understand that werewolves are very protective over their females, But you are not their female. You are my daughter." I laughed then. I couldn't help it. The situation was so absurd that I didn't know what else to do. This couldn't be because I was dating Jonathan. The thought was beyond what I could comprehend. Yes, werewolves were very protective of the females in the pack, but my dad was just as bad. Yes, they didn't like it when the females chose non-wolves as mates, but they accepted it, and they liked Jonathan. The males had taken non-wolf mates all the time. It was just a numbers thing, but the females were so few. I did glance at Jonathan then. He wasn't smiling either. I bit my lower lip. "This cannot all be because I'm dating him," I finally stated, looking back at my dad. "It isn't, but that is the part I'm most concerned about." Translation, that was the only part he was going to tell me. "Dad, they came to the party." He nodded. "Yes, they did. For you." What did that mean? I frowned and shook my head. Maybe I should talk to them. "No, I want you to stay away from them for a while, until I can get this worked out." He added the last part when my brows rose. I looked at Jonathan and saw the anger dancing just behind the supportive smile. What exactly had my pack been up to? "What if I talk to Track?" I offered, turning back to my dad. "Sweetheart, I know you don't completely understand this, but it's serious. Right now, I have to ask that you not have any contact with them." "Not even Track?" I gasped, and my dad nodded. "I don't understand, Dad. What are they hiding that's so bad?" "I never expected them to stoop this low," he hissed. He wasn't hiding his anger now, and I flinched. My dad had never jumped to conclusions about people, at least that I knew of. He had also always at least respected the pack. "Dad, if I could just talk to Track, I'm sure I could straighten this all out." My dad looked over at Jonathan then, and I followed his gaze. They stared at each other for a minute, and then my dad turned back to me. "Reina, they are so against you being with a vampire that they are making up stories to try to lay claims on you." "What?" I shrieked and actually jumped back until I hit the back of the couch. "I didn't want to tell you this part, but I'm worried that you won't believe how serious this has become." He reached out and put a hand on my knee. I blinked at him, still trying to process what he had said. "How? What could I?" was all I could say as his words swam too fast in my head. He moved his chair closer and took one of my hands. "Don't worry. I told them I saw through their plans." "Plans?" I choked on the words, my eyes wide. My dad's jaw twitched. "That alpha of theirs tried to tell me that you should belong to one of them, and not to a vampire," he spit, his eyes tightening. I felt his hand shaking in mine. I giggled out of pure madness, slapping a hand over my mouth as I did. This couldn't be happening. Maybe it was a dream. I looked around and even reached down and pinched my arm. Ouch! That hurt. Dang it. There was no way this was real. Weird things happened to me, that much was true. But this? I kept shaking my head as my dad watched. I couldn't fathom any of this. It had to be a mistake. Ryan wouldn't storm over and demand me for one of the pack males. The thought made me giggle again. Not that any of this was even a little funny, but my mind couldn't think of what else to do. The room went quiet and I lost focus, no longer seeing the room as my dad's words echoed in my ears. I knew Track had been protective and never really did like Jonathan, but that was just Track. Ryan, though? He was the pack alpha. He was above jealousy and... and I couldn't make myself think past that point. I started to feel my mind overload, and then I started to go numb. The emotions slammed into each other so hard, then they just fell away, leaving me slightly tingly but unable to feel much of anything. Finally, my dad reached over and tweaked my nose. "You've always wanted to get out of the manor and explore things." I nodded, focusing on his voice. My mind was strangely in need of being rescued, and I let his words pull me. "It seems you're going to get your chance now." Again I nodded, leaning forward and hanging on his every word. Save me, Daddy, I thought, and I wanted so badly for this to go away. Something in my mind was shutting down the pain and confusion, and I let it. If I didn't, I felt like I would go completely mad. My dad smiled then. "Jonathan and I have some things planned that I think you might enjoy." "Okay," I replied almost mechanically, hungry for this to all disappear. My mind couldn't even wrap around the possibility that my pack would do anything so horrible, and so, instead, my mind pushed it out, and I let it. Jonathan smiled. "That's what we talked about most of the time." I blinked at my dad, who winked. "I think you'll enjoy the distractions." Guilt slithered in just a bit, and I shook my head. I think I should call track and... "Reina, you said you would trust me on this." "I did?" He nodded, and I sighed. "Okay." "Good," he stated, standing up. Jonathan joined him, and I looked up at both of them. Jonathan smiled, and I turned to him. He was wonderful, and had been so supportive of them. My lips tightened. I had seen how protective they were of their female werewolves. I was one of them. But I would never have thought that they would go to such extremes. I was only 1/4 wolf. It just didn't make any sense. They liked Jonathan. At least they had acted like they had. Now I doubted that, and my eyes watered. "Sweetheart?" I blinked up at my dad and nodded. He chuckled. "You didn't hear a word I just said, did you?" "Sorry," I whispered, and he smiled. "I was asking if you wanted to make a list of what you want brought over from the manor." "Oh." "How long will I be here?" I said in a small voice, pushing the emotions away to keep them from ripping my heart in two. "That almost sounds like you don't want to be here," Jonathan teased, and I managed a smile in his direction. My dad grinned at us and then looked at me. "I'm sure you'll want some things from home. Why don't you make a list and I'll have it sent over?" Handing my dad a list of underwear and other personal items was not appealing. "Can I call and talk to someone instead?" When he eyed me, I balked. Wow. Did he think I would do something like call track, pretending I was calling the manor? Dang. I should have thought about that sooner. It might have worked. Then I shook my head. Things had went very, very badly last time I snuck around. What if I call Paige? Paige? I nodded, suddenly feeling bad for separating her and Michael. My emotions needed something to focus on, so I settled for guilt on their behalf. My dad looked at Jonathan, who seemed to get where I was going with it, at least the innocent guilt part. That would be a great idea. Maybe she could even come when they bring it. He winked at me, and I gave him a grateful smile. Then my dad got it and laughed. I see. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number, ignoring my huffing at not trusting me to even do that. He asked for Paige and then looked over at Jonathan. "You really need a bigger place," he chuckled. "Oh, Dad," I yelped. "We found one that looks almost like a miniature manor." Something positive to think about. "Really?" I nodded quickly. "Yes, it even has a bit of woods around it. I couldn't believe it. It's like someone took the manor, made it a bit smaller, and, well, put it in a different place. But it is so awesome." I didn't see the look on Jonathan's face as I poured out the details. Hey, like I said, I was messed up emotionally. Hang on, my dad said into the phone and smiled as I nearly bounced and told him all about the place Jonathan and I had seen on the website. Jonathan, however, became very quiet. When I finished, I reached up and snatched the phone. Paige, I smiled when she replied, then walked out into the hall to start on my list of what I needed. The guilt, pain, and anger buzzed inside of me, but I pushed them away and focused on getting Paige over here. My heart squeezed tightly, and I put a hand over my chest as she talked. Focus on her voice. I just had to focus on her voice. That's where I'm going to stop.